as mainstream as anybody's. It's just that they're not being touted as such. I think labor has ceded the values terrain to those who see values in a far more restrictive way, and they can't do that if they're going to survive. And I argue in the book that if they did jump into that, it would have huge political ramifications. It would not only help labor, it would help the Democratic Party, and more importantly, it would help the country have serious debates. Labor also needs to improve its internal governance, not just combating corruption, and labor's done a lot there that's been underreported. And by the way, we can talk more about the media's role in all this if you'd like when I'm done. But also in terms of greater transparency and democracy, energizing the rank and file, more diverse leadership, and reaching out to new communities of workers. And finally, labor really needs to learn how to communicate. And that may sound mundane, but I'd argue that there's nothing labor can do that would be more radical and also more significant to ensuring its future than if it learned to figure out what it wants to say, craft an effective message, and then really communicate it. Now, how dysfunctional is the relationship between the media and labor? Rather than give a long answer, let me just give an example. 2 weeks ago, when I called the National Union headquartered in Washington, I had a very simple, non-threatening question I wanted to ask. So I called the union, and I was greeted by one of these answering machines. I guess they were saving some workers too. Greeted by an answering machine that said, walked me through a long thing, and then said, if you want to reach communications, press 141. So I pressed 141, and I heard, goodbye. So I figured that was a technical glitch. I called back, did the whole thing, heard, goodbye. So I called back and ended up at the General President's office and asked the Secretary how I reached somebody in communications. And she said, well, let me take your name and number. I said, oh, no problem giving you my name and number, but how do I reach somebody in communications? And she said, well, this is the way we do it. I said, well, where are your communications people? She said, well, they're in Las Vegas. They're based in Las Vegas? Well, not all of them. Okay, well, wherever they are, how do I reach them? Give me your number. So I did that. Next day, I had no answer. 30 hours later, Friday afternoon, so I called back, and I said, how do I reach these people? And she said, I've done my job. This is the way we do it. And I said, well, I'm sure you've done your job, but how do I reach these people? I need to reach somebody. And she said, well, this is what we do. I said, okay, where are you located? She said, Washington. I said, I know that, but what's your address? She hangs up. Okay, so Monday, I called back and I ended up with jurisdiction. And I say, how do I reach communications? She said, give me your name and number. I said, no, I don't want to go through this again. And she said, well, this is just how we do it. So, bottom line is I got nowhere. All I wanted to do, to be honest, was my publisher wanted the names of some major unions to send a copy of the book. That's how threatening that was. Now, I found in dealing with, and in the book, I make it clear that the whole communications problem is half media's fault and half labor's fault. And I could write a book about what the media do wrong. But more importantly, labor focuses on what the media does wrong, but that's the part of the equation that labor can't do anything about. What labor can affect is what it does. And I found basically over the years four fundamental approaches that labor takes in dealing with the media. One is the ostrich approach. When I just started in St. Louis, where I worked for 10 years covering business and labor, I heard one day, I got a call one day from a corporation that it was closing it was terminating a shift in a plant, and it was laying off hundreds of workers. They didn't want to tell me that, but they wanted to get ahead of the news. I mean, it wasn't good for them to say, but they wanted to get ahead of it and put their spin on it, so they called me. I called the local union. I was naive and new at this, and I figured they'd be all too eager to talk because at the very least it sounded like they cared, and at the most maybe they could actually do something. So I called, and I heard a click on the phone. Again, because I was new at this, I thought, problem. I called back and I said, sorry, I think we got disconnected. This time the phone got slammed kind of loudly. And I called back a third time and said, look, I don't really care if you don't say anything. It's going to make my job in writing the story easier, but you're just going to look kind of callous in the paper tomorrow if that's your response. And then a few choice expletives later, he slammed down a phone. And the thought there is, if we don't talk, the story will simply go away. Of course, the story doesn't go away. What goes away is labor's chance to have an input. Now, to be fair, that doesn't happen on the national level. The problem is that on the local level is where most of the news is, where news really occurs. It affects people, where people work, where people form their opinions. And most of labor's communications resources are at the national or state levels. And at the local level, that I don't blame that guy. He was a year off the line himself. He had no help staff. He knows he's going to be competing if he gets into this with a slick corporate lawyer or a vice president or a PR guy, and he knows he can't compete, so he'd just rather not. Another tactic that labor follows is intimidation. I'm not going to get into this too deeply now, but in trying to cover a labor story, I've been nearly pushed off hotel roofs, I've been shoved in front of buses, I've been screamed at, I've had doors slammed at me, and sometimes I wonder, wouldn't a simple letter to the editor suffice?
Seriously.
Then there's a good guy syndrome, and this is a Teamster specialty. They'll talk to you as long as somebody will vouch for you, as long as somebody personally knows you. Once when I was in St. Louis, I got a call from the Central Conference of Teamsters, which is the largest Teamster group of the 4 geographic entities, that there was a major meeting going to happen in St. Louis, and I should go recover it right away. And it was just a couple of blocks from my office. So I walked over there, thinking I was going to get a good story out of this. I said to somebody, where does the press register? And they said, there is no place to register. I said, okay. So I tried to walk through a door, and 2 doorway-sized guys stood in front of me, blocked me. And I said, excuse me, I have here's my press badge. And they just looked away. And I said, your own conference in Chicago just said I need to cover this. And they were entirely uninterested and looked away. And the doors open, and a guy comes out from the meeting, and somebody else in there sees me and says, hi, Phil. And these 2 guys suddenly part and say, sorry, we didn't know you were okay, brother. So I walked in. Now, that's endearing, and I've had other similar instances in Detroit and everywhere. The problem is that can labor really afford that kind of approach in a wired world where corporations have no such compunctions? They'll talk to anybody, anytime, day or night. Finally, there's a massive press release approach. That's probably the most common, where unions simply put you to sleep by sending out these generic press releases one after another about every single event possible, to the point where reporters simply don't read them anymore. Now, I understand again that how responsible the media are for a lot of this. We don't report much on labor. What we do report is mostly sensationalistic. We focus on corruption or picket line violence or strikes or that kind of thing. And just the terminology we use. I mean, why do we talk about a labor dispute when it's a labor management dispute? We could just as easily call it a management dispute. Well, why do we talk about labor bosses when the union guys are the only guys who are actually elected in the workplace, and the executives are the ones who can really hire and fire people? Or why do we talk about management offers certain terms and labor is demanding something? Why can't we turn that around? Why can't we say that workers are offering to work for certain conditions, but management is demanding they do something else? Now, what can labor do? What can labor accomplish when it puts all these things together? When it really communicates, when it engages in values, when it involves the rank and file? The first 2 chapters of my book deal with 2, I hope, pretty dramatic examples of what it can. The first are the firefighters in Iowa, and the second were catfish workers in Mississippi. These are 2 very different instances, but they have a lot in common. They both faced enormous odds, and they both won. Firefighters in Iowa, basically, in 2004, had endorsed John Kerry at a time when he was at about 8% in the polls and going nowhere, doing so badly that he was dubbed dead man walking because he had no momentum, no chance of going anywhere. Meanwhile, 2 other opponents were not only stronger and had a lot more money, Dine and Gephardt, but they were endorsed by most of labor.